You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 79. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my lovely friend. It's Paula here. I am so glad to have you joining me this week for this podcast episode. If you're new, welcome. I hope you enjoy it. We are talking today about problems and problems that you solve versus problems that you manage. If this is a concept that is new to you, I think it is going to be a game changer. And even if it's one that you're familiar with, I think it'll be worth revisiting in the context of today's discussion. Before we dive in, just thought I'd update you on a few things that are going on in my life. It has been busy. I'm sure you can relate. And yesterday I had the pleasure of moderating 2 speaking engagements, one webinar at noon, and the other was a hybrid event in downtown Vancouver. It was put on by the Canadian Bar Association Women Lawyers Forum. And we had 2 incredible speakers. They are both retired judges, the Honorable Sandra Balance and the Honorable Jane Darty. And they spoke to a group of us women lawyers. I, of course, am a coach, former lawyer, and they talked about rejecting the myth of Superwoman. And it was a discussion about practice, the realities of practicing law as a woman, some of the challenges that they overcame, that they faced in their practice. They talked about confidence and imposter syndrome and overcoming self-doubt and really discovering a way to practice that resonates with you, one that builds on your strengths, one that aligns with your values. And it was so inspiring. And there was a group, there were about 40 of us there in person. There were about 30 attending online. And it really emphasized for me the importance of having community, of having women in your life who support you. And for all of you who are listening, I would invite you to think about who you have in your community, in your professional community, those people who support you and who you in turn support. And it gets me to thinking also about the membership community that I am creating, that I have talked about before on the podcast, that will be starting in January. And I'm delighted that I have started hearing from some of you who have expressed an interest in learning more about it. And so I will do that. And if you are interested, please reach out to me. You can send me an email. You can send me a message on LinkedIn. Nothing fancy. Just let me know that you're interested in learning more, because I want to create a membership that will serve you, one where you will feel like part of a community, one where you will have an opportunity to grow and build and develop your practice in a way that you feel supported and surrounded by like-minded women lawyers. And so please do let me know if this is something that you're interested in. I think the emphasis on community is key. I also am mindful of how busy everybody is. And so my goal is to create a program that has maximum impact relative to the investment of time that you need to make. So I've got my thinking cap on. I'm daydreaming about it. And I'm excited to share more with you as we get closer. And before we turn to the content, one last thing. I opened into my LinkedIn account today and received the most delightful email message. And so I just wanted to read it out to you. It is this: I wanted to let you know that I am obsessed with your podcast. It's truly the best. Thank you. You know who you are. I so much appreciate this note. It was just so inspiring, and it helps me feel so motivated knowing that as I'm recording these podcast episodes, that you're tuning in and listening. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. And with that, we are going to dive into today's topic, which is problems. Problems you solve versus problems you manage. Now, this is a concept that I wish I could take credit for, but I cannot. It is a concept that was developed by John Gottman, who is a relationship expert. He runs, or ran at least, the Gottman Institute, which studied marriages. And from what I understand, he even had this setup. It was like a house type thing where couples would go and be studied. And through his studies of married couples, what he discovered was that 69% of problems in marriages are not resolvable. 69%. These are relationships where people have chosen each other because they love each other. And still, 69% of their problems are not solvable. And this was an eye-opener for me when I learned this concept, because up until that point, I'd always thought that problems were something that you needed to solve, right? An unsolved problem was kind of like when you've got open tabs or multiple apps running on your computer and they drain your energy. If you don't have to solve a problem, then what? And that's really the focus of today's podcast episode is, what do you do with problems that you don't solve, but problems that you manage? And of course, we're not looking at your marriage. I don't think I'm qualified to talk about marriage counseling. It's not my thing. But I am qualified to talk to you about your career, about your work, about how problems might show up for you there, and how some of them may not be solvable, and that's okay. So what are some examples? Well, if you look at a solvable problem in a marriage, it might be something like meal planning. Maybe one partner feels like they do 7 days a week and they want their partner to do a couple of days. So they come to an agreement, problem solved. If you're at work, you may find there's a computer glitch. Your document doesn't open or something happens to it. You call IT, they come over and they fix it. So those are solvable problems. Whereas some problems are ones that you might need to manage. So let's say you're in a marriage relationship. One of you is a spender, the other is a saver. You may find that throughout the course of your marriage, you have a back and forth over what to do with your money. At work, you may find you have unsolvable problems when it comes to time management. You might find that you create systems for yourself and finally they start working and then something happens and they no longer work. Maybe you are struggling to balance your work and your non-work life. Maybe you've got small kids at home and you're dealing with that work-life integration. Even if you don't have kids, it can still be a challenge. Maybe that's a problem that has not yet been solved. Maybe it will never be solved. Maybe it's confidence. Maybe every time you reach a new milestone, the imposter syndrome sets in. You feel like you lack confidence. Maybe perfectionism rears its perfectionistic head. Maybe that is an ongoing challenge for you, as it is a problem that you may not be able to solve. And finally, maybe it's in relationships that you have at work, right? Maybe it's other lawyers that you work with. Maybe it's your clients. Maybe it's members of your team where you have differences and that poses challenges in your relationships with them. So the reason that I think this topic matters and the reason that we're talking about it today is that problems are a part of life. And part of the problem of problems is seeing something as a problem. So yes, that is a sentence with a lot of problems in it. But that is the gist of it. We are going to have problems, so let's figure out how best to deal with them. And what can happen is if you're constantly striving to solve an unsolvable problem, you might find that you never really feel happy. You might find that you get frustrated with yourself. You might get frustrated with the approach. You might keep thinking that something has gone wrong. You may find you're increasingly upset that your expectations are not aligning with reality. And you may spend a lot of your time and energy trying to fix something that doesn't actually need fixing. And as I was preparing for today's episode, it got me to thinking about a concept I discuss in relation to the joyful practice, or what is a joyful practice. And if you go back to episode 3, I talk about this idea of happiness and it being something that sometimes we chase. We think happiness is on the other side of a milestone or an achievement. And yes, if we attain that achievement, like we pass a test or we win the case or we get the promotion, there may be that momentary feeling of happiness. But if we're always putting our happiness, making it dependent on the attainment of a certain goal, we're always going to be chasing it. And so what we need to do is find joy in the process. And this is a concept that Shawn Achor talks about. And I think there's a parallel here that if we are looking to solve problems that cannot be solved and we are unhappy throughout that process because we haven't solved it, we're doing that unnecessarily. There's a different way of approaching it where you may not have to feel that way throughout. So what you might be doing to try to deal with these unsolvable problems, well, it may be that you're spending a lot of energy on something that can't be fixed, and then you feel disappointed, you feel frustrated. And it may be that your attempts to fix it, they're never going to work because the problem is, by definition, perpetual. So what we're going to talk about today is how to approach problems in such a way that you're not burning your batteries on trying to fix something that is not solvable. And I'm going to offer you 4 steps, and I'm also going to offer 2 bonuses, 2 bonus steps. And I think this will really help you in terms of how you approach problems. So step 1 is to define problem or redefine problem. So a problem, and you probably all have your own concept of what comes to mind when I say that word, is defined by the Oxford Languages Online Dictionary as a matter or situation regarded as unwelcome or harmful and needing to be dealt with and overcome. So that definition, I think, is really telling. Unwelcome, harmful, needing to be dealt with. When you see problems this way, you see them as negative, you see them as harmful, it's something that creates a sense of urgency, something that you need to fix. And if this resonates with you, then this step will be particularly effective. Because what I'm inviting you to do here is think of another way to approach the idea of a problem. So that same dictionary, Oxford Languages, also offers another definition of problem. And this is the math or physics definition, which is an inquiry starting from given conditions to investigate or demonstrate a fact, result, or law. So what's very interesting about this definition is that it's so neutral. First of all, it's an inquiry, right? This is not something that needs to be dealt with and overcome. This is an inquiry, a curiosity, questions, starting from given conditions. So it's not unwelcome or harmful. It's just given conditions to investigate or demonstrate. So if you could take a step back and define a problem in a much more neutral way, it may take away some of the judgment, some of the urgency to fix that problem that you might be experiencing currently. What are some other words you might use for a problem? You might describe it as an opportunity to learn or to grow. One of the words that I learned in my coach training was the concept of a growing edge. So an area where you might wish to improve. You might see problems as a challenge. Some of you love challenges. I know you do, because when I've been coaching clients of mine, often what they will say they love about their work is the fact that it's hard, that it's challenging, that they get to work in, they get to push the edges, they get to be in those new areas, etc. You might describe a problem as a situation, right? Much more neutral. And another way of looking at it, and this is one that I learned from my husband, he had a friend growing up in high school whose father was a businessman and a very successful one. And he said, if something happens and I can fix it by spending money on it, it is no longer a problem. It is an expense. So if you don't have the money, then even if it's an expense, that itself might be the problem. But it just shows you the flexibility that we get to choose what we define as a problem and what we define as something else. So once you have defined or redefined the term problem, then the next step, step 2, is to identify whether that problem is one that you can fix or one that you need to manage. And again, this is a concept that was very eye-opening for me, because up until that point, I'd always thought you need to solve a problem. But what if you don't need to solve it? So some examples in your practice of what might be a problem that you solve is maybe it's a practice area question for you. Maybe you're, and I spoke with a lawyer recently who made this transition, maybe you're in general commercial litigation and you find it's too broad. There is too much going on. There are too many forums for you to deal with. The subject matter is always different, and it's hard to feel like an expert in the work that you do. And so you pick an area that is more niched. Maybe it's employment. Maybe it's estate litigation. Maybe it's some area where you feel Like you can become much more of an expert within that practice area. So that might be a way of solving a problem for you. If you do not like being a generalist, becoming more of a niche practitioner, that might be problem solving. Similarly, there may be something about the job that you have right now that just doesn't work. Maybe you work in an office that is far away from your house, and you do not want to have a commute. So you take on a different job that is much closer or that allows you to work remotely. There is a problem that you have solved. Conversely, there might be problems that you need to manage. So, for example, timekeeping is something that comes up a lot in the work that I do with lawyers, figuring out how to create better systems for yourself. And what you might find is that a system that you develop today works for some time, but then it doesn't work any longer and you have to readjust it. It may be that you know that when you get promoted and you feel out of your depth, that you're going to have those imposter syndrome type feelings. That is a problem that you're going to need to manage. And if that is something that you struggle with, emotional regulation, I highly encourage you to check out the podcast episode that I did last week. If you haven't already, it's episode 78. It's with Bina Stock. She is a lawyer turned counselor. She's absolutely brilliant. And she shares some very practical strategies about emotional regulation and how you can get a handle on difficult emotions like anxiety, like fear, like frustration, like anger. And within that episode, she takes me through a very fun exercise. And I say fun because she took me into a situation where I sometimes struggle to regulate my emotions. And so you get to see how you can apply some of the tools that she teaches within that episode. So go back. It's amazing. Another area where you may need to manage your problems is with colleagues, clients, and others with whom you have relationships where it's hard. And going back to that marriage example, if you choose to marry somebody, you love that person, and yet 69% of your problems are not resolvable, you can only imagine how many unresolvable problems you're going to have with the people that you interact with within your career. And the purpose of today's episode is really to give you some ideas and some tools to navigate those relationships differently so that you're not necessarily fixated on trying to solve the problems in your relationship, but rather to focus your attention elsewhere so that you can manage them and have those relationships thrive. So once you have identified whether you need to manage or solve a problem, then you get to manage it. And I have a few ideas here on how you can do that. The first is to raise your awareness and acknowledge that there are problems that you will need to manage. So, for example, let's say that you create a timekeeping system or a time management system that uses notifications. And initially, those notifications are really effective. You hear the ping and right away you hop to task, get it done, cross it off your list. But over time, you notice that you aren't as receptive to the sound of the ping. You might find that you allow those notifications to stack up. You eventually stop listening to them. The awareness and acknowledgement part of that is, rather than judging yourself or judging the system, you simply have your awareness that, okay, this is a problem. Time management is a challenge for me, and this is something that I'm going to keep having to work at over time. And if a system wears off, it doesn't mean that I'm a failure or that there's something inherently wrong with this system. It just means I need to adjust it. Other areas where you may acknowledge that it's an ongoing problem, again, it's that feeling of imposter syndrome every time you move up a level. It's feeling like, those relationships that you have where you're going to have differing views, that maybe there's a lawyer that you work with where it's going to be challenging, and then becoming aware of that and acknowledging that it is an ongoing problem that you are choosing to manage. The next step in managing that problem is to accept it, to allow it. You may have heard that expression, what you resist persists, or the 12-step mantra, give me the strength to accept what I cannot change. So the idea here is, once you have acknowledged that there is a problem that you need to manage, let go of the resistance. It will make your life so much easier. Then you get to decide whether or not you want to do something about the problem. So let's say, for example, you have a friend and she is consistently 15 minutes late for any appointment that you make with her, whether it's lunch or a movie or a meeting or a phone call. And so once you have acknowledged that this is who she is, and once you have accepted that that is who she is, you may find that that is enough. You may not need to do anything at all. Or you might find that you want to develop a strategy. Maybe whenever you go to meet her, you bring a book with you so that you can spend your time reading while you wait for her. Or maybe you show up yourself 15 minutes late, knowing that that's roughly the time that she will show up. So there may be strategies that you use to deal with that, knowing that it's a problem that you are going to be managing. Maybe you set boundaries. So maybe you've decided to go to a movie together and you set a time to meet, and you know that if she's 15 minutes late, you're going to miss the beginning of the movie. So you might let her know that if she doesn't arrive by a certain time, you're going to go into the theater and you'll meet her there. You might be setting a boundary like that with her. Or you might make a request. Maybe there's a situation where you really need her to be on time. It's something that is time sensitive. It really matters. So you can ask her, knowing that she may or may not be able to comply with that. And then finally, in terms of managing these ongoing or unsolvable problems, is to revisit the way that you are approaching the problem. So when you find a way to manage, recognize that it may not be a forever solution. So just to recap, the strategies that I'm offering here in terms of how to approach the challenges of ongoing problems, the ones that don't have a solution, is to number one, define the problem or to redefine it. Number two is to decide whether it is a problem that you can solve or a problem that you need to manage. And then if you are managing the problem, number one is to be aware of it and to acknowledge it. Number two is to accept and allow it. Number three is to decide whether you want to do anything about it, and if so, what, whether it's a strategy, a boundary, a request. And then finally, the fourth step is to revisit, right? As this is an ongoing practice, the management is ongoing, revisit it from time to time and see if you need to recalibrate. Now, I also mentioned that there were two bonuses, so here they are. Number one, appreciate. So when you have a problem like this, I would invite you to think about what you can appreciate, what is good or great about that situation. Now, what comes to mind for me is in my practice, things really shifted for me when I started a family. And having young kids at home and being in a situation where I wanted and needed to be home on time for them, without question, required me to constrain in my professional work and redefine and restructure the way that I do things. And so in a sense, that was a gateway for me to move from practicing law, which I, until that point, had really enjoyed. And there are still elements of the practice that I miss it, but I was really called to do the work that I'm doing now, which is the coaching, which is the speaking. And so because of that shift that I made, it required me to really lean into something that I was so passionate about and to create a way of working that allows for a bit more balance and integration. Now, is it perfectly balanced? No, not at all. But it works for all of us. So that is a way of finding something that I can appreciate about the challenges that came, particularly at the beginning, with managing family and work. So that's bonus one. Bonus two is to admire. Now, this really applies to relationships probably more than anything. But if you go back to that friend who's 15 minutes late without fail, I would invite you to think about what it is that you truly admire about her. So maybe, yes, she's always 15 minutes late, but she is the best listener on the planet. And she has the best ideas. And she is always there when you need her. So if you can start to look at what you admire in those relationships, it has a way of lessening the effect of the problems or the so-called problems that maybe to this point you thought you needed to fix. Now, why this approach will work? When you're not trying to solve an unsolvable problem, you will stop spending your energy on what is not working, and you will have more energy to focus on what is working. You will have greater awareness of what types of problems you're facing, how you perceive them, right? Going back to the connotations that we have around problems. And you will also find that you're able to be more accepting. you're able to appreciate what is good about certain problems. And as you're able to have more emotional dexterity around the way that you approach problems, you will find that you feel like you have more control over your side of the problem, and those problems may not feel as great. Some of the skills that you're going to need for this, number one, is to take a scientist's approach, looking at problems from a more neutral lens, looking at how you're going to manage them, approaching them with curiosity instead of judgment. It will require a willingness to not fix things or complete things. And that might be really hard if you have a perfectionistic way of looking at things, if you're very much attached to black and white thinking. And it is also a willingness to be adaptable. So it means trying and seeing how a solution or a way of managing might work for some period of time, but then you might need to adapt. The results that you will create, you'll create more peace in your relationships. You'll create more ease when it comes to dealing with problems and challenges. And what you'll find is when you let go of the resistance that you might be experiencing right now, it will just feel less hard. So that, my friends, is what I have to offer you today. And I very much hope that this way of looking at problems, of distinguishing between the ones that you solve and the problems that you simply manage, has the effect of taking the burden off your shoulders of having to fix everything and allowing you to find peace in a practice that isn't necessarily always perfect all of the time. And as I'm speaking, one of the concepts that was shared last night, this idea of surfing the chaos, that was something that really stuck with me. Surfing the chaos. Maybe it will help you surf the chaos, knowing that you do not need to fix every problem, that it's perfectly okay for them to simply be there and for us to work around them. So with that, my friend, thank you so much for tuning in this week. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If these podcast episodes resonate with you, please do leave a rating and review wherever it is that you download your podcast. It does help other listeners find the podcast, and I always love hearing from you. If you would like to reach out to me, please feel free to do so. Send me an email, a note on LinkedIn. It's just always such a pleasure to connect. So have a wonderful week, and I look forward to connecting with you again soon. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.